Also, the rising sun trickles out. We'll get started. We hope that everyone's doing well. I'll do a quick couple of slides on just logistics. Appreciate anyone who's sharing any of their thoughts. We're in week 2, kind of reaching 30-ish% through kernel, which is surprising, but also exciting. We're just going to be like in this quiet period for at least the next 2 weeks, where we hope you've started to settle in, you started to get a sense of who's around and the fact that you can tap into different pockets of the web, and of course with different people, through just who's in this kernel block and through the mentors and the extended web, and that you have a bit more space to focus in on your project. And that's where the office hours comes in. We've already had something like 25 people present over the first 2 weeks, and office hour signups for next week are open. I think there's already 4-ish signups. So please do sign up. We think we can handle comfortably 12 to 16 presentations any given week. And this week is the first week where you can sign back up. If you signed up for week 1, week 3 is also available to you for another iteration if you're willing. So consider that. Consider any asks that you have for the group. Consider any offers that you'd like to make. And once again, just thanks for being with us. We're calling in for some help and support for this complicated module on money and speech and better questions. We're very lucky to have Annaliese Milano, Merfield, with us today. And I'm going to pass it to Andy to kind of help introduce her. But I'll start to touch on better questions. Money is this really, sometimes, let's say, what's the best word? It can kind of be in your face about how much we don't know about money, because we use it so often. And we have a general understanding, everyone has experience with it. But when you try to peel it back 1 layer or 2 layers or 3 layers, pretty quickly start to come across some confronting questions about the fact that there's a lot about this system that we still don't know. And so this module starts with this call for better questions. And our hope for this hour is that we come to a better understanding of money than when it began, and that the rest of this block is really an experience in imagining new types of money alongside the projects that we built. I have some other slides, but I feel encouraged to just leave it to Andy. He changed, some slight wording in the syllabus in response to some of the conversations that we've been having before kernel block 10. And one of the ideas was around rehabilitating money and how that is in fact a core focus of the kernel curriculum, although there's all sorts of other things we can talk about. And so I'd love if, Andy, you could give an overview of where you feel module 2 sits and help us welcome in Annaliese.
Fantastic. Yeah, so Annaliese is a longtime friend and co-conspirator. If you read the brief from Mehrling Co about joyful subversions, Annaliese is something like the living manifestation of that in kernel land. Not only does she have one of my all-time favorite tattoos, she has also provided us with a wealth of insights and first-hand experience of David Graeber. And her own work is deeply informed by what he had to teach, but also adds her unique flavor and perspective and experiences, and that's something that I enormously value. And the reason that I actually reversed Vivek's request of me there is precisely because Annaliese's work is in fact a much more detailed, precise, and analytical excavation of some of the ideas that we've been hinting at or asking questions around in kernel, because her thesis, if anybody read it, I know Alia put it in the announcements channel and it's in the meaning module, Her thesis is called The Social Layer, right? And if you just take a look at the abstract, the sentence that I wanted to pull out of that was, she writes, her thesis details the way that Bitcoin and Ethereum organize social relationships in ways that intentionally diverge from existing economic institutions, and explores the implications of this for subjects such as financial inclusion, value, power, and community. And that to me is like the whole thing. You know, it's incredible that there's still 100+ pages after that in which we really get to delve into what that means. But that's everything, right? Like the intentional construction of social relationships that diverge from existing economic institutions, and what that means for value, power, and community. I think it's so lovely. I think it's really just some of the most incredible academic work that I've seen in a long time, and it is also because it diverges from a lot of the anthropological methodology in the crypto space up until this point in attempting to think with these communities. Annaliese came and participated in Kernel, and heard us kind of guffing about asking all of these questions, and guided us in all sorts of interesting ways, and has, in a very brave sense, especially for somebody in the more traditional academic world, contributed to the polyvocality. There's a lovely academic word for you. The many voices that exist in this community, and the diversity and plurality that is inherently a part of trying to reimagine what money might look like, and what really, like, habitable places or constructions might entail. So, like the rewording of the syllabus that has continued ever since we first wrote it in the Genesis block is precisely around it. It's like the ultimate social media is money, right? It is like the social medium, in fact. And so much of our own preconditioning and cultural expectation is that it is the thing that is furthest away from sociality. But by the law of complementary opposites, the thing that is the furthest away is also the thing which is most deeply informing of what it really means to cultivate a healthy, constructive, beneficial sociality, where individuation is premised upon mutual aid, for instance, where scarcity and reciprocity operates in harmony, where abundance and sacrifice operate in constructive harmony. All of these things begin to take on a different flavor when looked at through the lens of with rather than against, and through polyvocality, through many different voices and many different perspectives. So, I have learned an enormous amount from Annaliese. I think it's just a great privilege to have her with us. And I am told by my trusty ally Vivek that Annaliese, I think you have prepared just a few minutes overview of the thesis, because I can only give one sentence from the abstract. Having long ago walked away from academia, poor soul that I am. So perhaps we can hand over to you for any kind of bridging thoughts from what I've said there, and potentially a little bit more detail on the thesis itself and your recent work.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, both of you, for the very, very, very kind introduction. It's so nice to be here with you. It's hard for me to believe that it was about 4 years ago that I was a fellow. Time has absolutely flown. But no, I'd be delighted to talk to you a little bit more about the thesis, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I do have a few slides. I don't know if we can't use those, no worries. I can sort of wing it. If it's possible to share them, that's fine too.
Please.
Sorry, is it possible? Or?
It should be, yeah. You should be able to click into share. I just made you co-host just to double check.
Okay, great. Let's see. Sorry, I think my Zoom skills are slightly rusty since it's been a long time since COVID. Remind me where the share setting is?
It should be a big green button somewhere right down the middle of the Zoom. If you'd like to share a link, if it's on Google, I could also try to open up the slides. It should be green share.
I don't see it, but that's okay. I mean, we can go without for sure. It's no problem. So maybe just in the interest of simplicity, we'll go ahead and do that. Right. So let me just get my notes sorted. So my thesis was called The Social Layer. And so what I wanted to set about doing when I started my research on crypto this is sort of 2019, fall 2019, shortly before the COVID pandemic started, which was, if any of you were around then, it was a bear market in crypto at that time. It was kind of a strange time to be doing research. It was before DeFi, before the market started running out. But what I had seen in academia to that point was a lot of research that to me didn't really reflect the nature of the community. It didn't reflect the kind of differences that I saw between the sub-communities. It didn't reflect the kind of humor and just liveliness, the vivacity of the communities. And it didn't reflect the reflectiveness also of the people in crypto. I wasn't seeing that in the pages of academic journals or books and things like that. So I kind of wanted to try and take crypto very, very seriously as a researcher and sort out, what is going on here? What is this all about? So I went ahead and started my research in 2019, like I said. I chose to study Bitcoin and Ethereum because they were the two largest communities at the time. I think they probably still are, although I suppose Solana is kind of maybe making some gains here on Ethereum. And I was very interested in the kind of way that they had related but also distinctive visions of what money and economic governance should look like. And I was very interested in the dialogue between the communities. And I was also interested in this concept that David Graeber coined, which is called creative refusal. And creative refusal is this idea that culture is not necessarily something that's just passive, something that happens to us, but the idea is that culture is actually a more active political project in which people are operating by explicitly rejecting other projects. So there's this idea of kind of, responding to what you see in the world and doing differently and making active choices about what you want to do with your society. And I thought I kind of saw something of this in crypto. And so I'll kind of talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But first, I wanted to speak to some of the questions that were asked, directly in the module, which is, what is money? What is value? And these are incredibly complicated questions. And for my part, looking at crypto, I think, there's just a huge amount of discussion about these things. And you can ask different people and they will tell you different things. But that said, what I understood after several years of research was that many people in crypto seem to think that money is socially constructed. So what does that mean? When we talk about something like Bitcoin and we ask people why it's valuable, a lot of times people will say, oh, well, Bitcoin's valuable because it's very scarce. The supply is limited, this sort of thing. And then if you push them a little bit and you sort of say, right, well, but what happens if the supply changes? It's not totally fixed. It could happen that by majority consent, the supply of Bitcoin eventually changes, and then what? Well, they'll say, well, actually, it's the belief that the supply is never going to change that makes something like Bitcoin valuable. And so you start getting into these questions of belief, and you also hear this in the Ethereum community. For example, if you've ever heard anybody say, money is a meme, I think that this is also... Oh, sorry, I didn't catch that. Was that...
Just some background noise. Okay.
Oh, okay, background noise, great. And so I think you also get at this kind of point when you hear people say money is a meme, and the idea that we can meme money into existence, whether that's a meme coin or whether it's something more, like ETH or like Bitcoin. And so from there we get to this idea that money is, I think, closely linked with power and persuasion. And who has the most power and the means of persuading? It's the state. And so when we look at something like fiat money and we ask, why is fiat money an institution? Why is it lasted? Why is it compelling? Why do people tend to see it as something that is natural and kind of inevitable? In crypto, people will start to tell you this is something that's linked to the power of the state. And their kind of ability to persuade people that the dollar is inevitable, their ability to use the dollar as an instrument of so-called statecraft in some instances. And also, of course, there's the force that the state has, which is something David Graeber talks about a lot in his work, which is that ultimately, at the end of the day, there are people with guns who back the dollar. But online, I think a lot of people told me, we haven't had force, migrated to the digital context. But if you take this idea that money is something that is socially constructed, that is a kind of product of getting people to believe in something and mobilizing that collective belief, that's quite a powerful hack in a sense. And that's a hack that, we can use. And so I think I see in crypto that this is how people think about money, which is ultimately that if it's socially constructed, if the state has socially constructed money in a convincing way, we can do that too, and we can do it differently. We just have to get people to kind of believe in it. So there's this idea of you can kind of co-opt the power of the state, so to speak. And so I think this position has paved the way for all sorts of new strategies for accumulating wealth in crypto, which have undermined the state's role in mediating the value of money, but also in mediating the circulation of capital. And so one other thing my research does, I think that's important, is to ask, I think in academia, you get so much hand-wringing about, well, oh, isn't crypto just gambling? And isn't it all just sort of speculation? And isn't this just terrible for the world and stuff like that? But I think what often goes unrecognized is that crypto is, for a lot of people, part of a kind of broader strategy in their lives. And by that, I mean, it's, when we talk about something like generational wealth, for example, we're talking about finding the means to obtain wealth that kind of sustains us through our life. I think when I spoke to a lot of my interlocutors in crypto, I found that a lot of people were really, really worried about financial insecurity. A lot of us are sort of millennials or Gen Z, and these are generations that are facing, in the United States especially, kind of an unprecedented level of downward mobility. We are the generations who look to our parents and think, ooh, you had it pretty easy, really. For you, maybe the American dream was still present in some sense, or at least the promise of upward mobility was still, dangling before you. But for us, that promise is more or less gone. A lot of people grew up in the aftermath of the financial crisis. A lot of people saw their kind of prospects dashed by that, their hopes for financial security dashed by that. A lot of people get to their 30s and they struggle to buy a home. All of these kinds of markers of adult life, in a sense, we as a generation are really struggling to attain them. And so this is the kind of perspective that in anthropology we would call social reproduction. And it's asking, like, how is society reproduced? How do people progress through their life? How do they get the means to do these sorts of things, to reach these kind of markers of adulthood and these sort of important mile markers in life, whether it's something like in our society, buying a home, getting married, having kids, you name it, there's lots of them. So I think crypto, when people talk about generational wealth, is really implicated in these processes of social reproduction. So it's really implicated in the ways that we're trying to survive capitalism, in a sense. It's really implicated in the way that we're trying to kind of make it through this, financially precarious time. And so generational wealth is not just wealth, but it's wealth that can do something that's, that goes beyond sustaining just basic needs. It's wealth that facilitates purchases and investments that allow people to progress through the key phases of their life, like I said. And so another kind of big theme in the research, which I've already referenced, is economic governance. And the way that our kind of existing, and I should say that my research was really based in the US and kind of looking outward from the US. And so this kind of, it might sound slightly US-centric. But effectively, I think what people in crypto realize is that the economic governance that we have in the United States as it stands is inhibiting these processes of social reproduction in a big way. And that the policies that we have very important distributive consequences. But also, economic governance in the United States is not really something that you get to participate in very directly as a citizen, whether that's because we have an independent central bank, or whether that's because we have sort of technocratic regulatory agencies like the SEC. And this is, of course, something like the SEC has become a big problem in crypto, particularly as it tried to, regulate crypto away in the name of investor protection policies. But I think what's very interesting is the way that crypto has put pressure on the SEC to kind of radically change accredited investor policies and to radically rethink what consumer protection means in an era where people are facing downward mobility, where they don't have a lot of access to risk, but they want access to risk in the markets. They want to be able to speculate. They want opportunities to do these things, but they're being prevented from doing them. And so where does the blockchain kind of come into all of this? If we have kind of a mainstream financial system that people see as corrupt, if we have a form of money, the dollar, that people also see as corrupt and that's entangled in all sorts of kind of debt, for one, and also expansionist aims of the US in other ways. For example, the way that the US puts its debt in central banks around the world, or for example, the way that the US has used aid money or institutions like the World Bank and the IMF to kind of further its geopolitical aims. People problematize these things in crypto. So what is the point? What does the blockchain do differently? I think the argument that I make in the thesis is that the blockchain is a kind of counterpoint to traditional economic institutions, and that it is intended to reorganize social relationships in contrast to something like the dollar, in contrast to something like the central bank or commercial banks. And the blockchain places technical constraints on what people can and cannot do within the system. It's also a shared record of truth that provides the very basis for social life in crypto. And I think importantly, it's a system that enables people to refuse some relationships in favor of others. And so what do I mean by that? I think it's important to think about when the blockchain was created. And when Satoshi Nakamoto released Bitcoin, we're talking about the height of the financial crisis. And if you look at all of his posts in the Peer-to-Peer Foundation or the mailing list and things like that, you'll see references to the central bank, you'll see references to, corrupt government, all sorts of things. I think in many ways, Bitcoin was designed to be responsive to those circumstances. It's not just something that should be looked at independently of what's going on in the wider economy, but I think it's very much in dialogue with what's going on in the economy. And in that way, I think it stands in direct contrast to something like the dollar, in the way that it's an opt-in system, in the way that it's decentralized, in the way that it has a fixed supply currency in an age where bailouts and quantitative easing, basically monetary expansion was exceedingly common, or became exceedingly common. So I'm looking at Bitcoin as something that's like a check on the dollar, intended to be a kind of comment on the trustworthiness of the dollar, or sort of the US government more generally. And so let me sort of do a few summarizing points that might tie all of those kind of loose thoughts together. So in short, I think what I'm trying to say with my research is that I think, contrary to what people say in academia and very often in the media, what crypto people are doing, I think, amounts to a sort of economic reform. I think what crypto is fundamentally about designing alternatives to traditional financial institutions in response to several related issues. One, the fact that economic governance has distributive implications. And two, the fact that despite that, it's very difficult to democratically influence the governance of the economy. And so I'm suggesting that crypto people make very explicit links between these issues and the financial circumstances of their generation, which, viewed against, as I said, the wealth and the opportunities enjoyed by our parents at a similar age, are actually quite bleak. And so as a result, I think that in crypto, we see the creation of new financial infrastructures and new strategies of accumulation in the pursuit of generational wealth that can kind of, help us survive the vagaries of capitalism, so to speak.
Amazing.
So I'll leave it there if you want to.
Thank you. Yeah. I think it's a really wonderful place to end this idea of designing alternative financial systems. And I'll just draw upon a touch more from the syllabus. There's two deepest links in this module. Annaliese has helped us cover some in spirit, at least, in the fact that her research starts with a deep understanding of David Graeber's work and debt. So that's one of the ones that looks the furthest back, 5,000 years. And then the second link is this link called Banking in the Shadows, which talks about the natural hierarchy of money and is taught contextually about both balance sheets, how banks think about liquidity and solvency, and in particular, just like a deep study of how the banks themselves work. And if Annaliese so helpfully positioned what's going on in crypto as a response to, a counterpoint to the existing financial system, then we think that this series of links is a spot in kernel that has kind of the deepest history of not only like what was money and debt over the first 5,000 years, but in this, it's in particular like, how does the current financial system work or operate? And so I just want to double tap on it, not only for this moment, but really this is a link to a whole other online course on the natural hierarchy of money. And so consider it a rabbit hole if you so choose. But the part that I wanted to poke at most specifically to try to tie back and maybe we can kind of, Annaliese, see if you have any responses, but also just get into open dialogue, is kind of like, how did we find this course? And it was due to a man named Ethan Buckman, who co-founded Cosmos, another kind of important and influential crypto project. And most recently, Cosmos, we've already brought up cycles a couple times in kernel, but they've been really thinking of, and quite seriously thinking about this idea of alternative financial infrastructure that Annaliese again just brought up. In many ways, I think Bitcoin has kind of solidified into this place that Annaliese mentions. It's the hardest and most kind of like clear and protected story within the crypto space. There is a strong belief that the 21 million Bitcoin that are there will remain there, even with questions about Bitcoin's economic security over the next 20 to 30 years. There's a general social belief that Bitcoin will stay relatively passive. In Ethereum and Solana world, there's kind of like a meeting with the government where they are happening now. There's regulators who are making new motions to be more welcoming to cryptocurrencies, especially in the US, but trickling elsewhere. There's the rise of stable coins and the rise of kind of like traditional payments infrastructure. And most notably, Ethereum and Solana have both, in differing ways, been really focused on assets, on early in Ethereum, initial coin offerings, and this idea that you can create, coins that can be used to fund things. That all is a whole rabbit hole that maybe is not as relevant today. But then in Solana world, again, asset generation. How do we influence capital markets? How do we approach generational wealth from a point of like, I need to generate it in some way, and I need to be there early and be a part of it in that way. And Green Lady Ramona, I mean, you asked a really nice question that I hope we do get back to in the chat about generational versus generative wealth. Maybe that's a question again for later discussion. But that's where I think Ethan grounds us back. They're working on a project called Informal Systems, and they have incubated a project called Cycles.money. And I just wanted to play a brief snippet. We were hopeful that Ethan would be able to join us today, but at least in spirit, if everyone doesn't mind, I'd like to play a brief snippet from a talk he gave at Stanford earlier this year, about 6 months ago. It only has 379 views on YouTube, but for us, it seems quite relevant because his critique of most blockchain communities to this point, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, is this point number 3 here, the overemphasis on transfer and exchange of assets, and less of a thought to the liability side of the balance sheet. So there's some points of critique here in the payment systems that you could point to traditional financial system, but then also you see critiques of indeed these alternatives in air quotes that he thinks in the crypto ecosystem we haven't been going far enough. There's an overemphasis on transfer and exchange of assets. And then if you go to number 5, again, a critique that spans the traditional financial system and traditional crypto systems, which is this idea of market making dealers and liquidity provisioning. The idea that like so much of the innovation in crypto has been about automated market makers and allowing for liquidity, whereas his suggestion, as you'll hear, is a bit more about debt. So we'll let it play for just a few minutes because I know it's not. We can wait until we have Ethan, but I'll click play.
Or to issue money. So this was a lot. I hope you don't feel too overloaded. If you need just a single takeaway, respect the graph. Okay, there's a graph of liabilities out there in the world, and that's the thing that we want to respect and honor and take advantage of. And just to zoom out, I mean, this idea that money is where the payments are, we're trying to set out conceptual concepts, not just for us and what we're building, but for everyone to really, ground how we think about building payments and finance. And, the simplest way I can think about money is that it's for denominating and discharging debt. Right? It's for making payments. And you have the functions of money that can be understood very simply in this conception, right? The unit of account is for denominating debt. The medium of exchange is for discharging debt here and now. The store of value is for discharging debt elsewhere or later. And so much of our focus in crypto has been on the store of value function, a little bit on the medium of exchange function, but really only with stable coins, right? But there's a more general conception that we can have to apply these functions as we build systems that serve the different functions of money, and that's sort of what we're going to be talking about. So, I like to ask myself this question. Armed with a unit of account, we can denominate unlimited amounts of debt. Right? I can say you owe me $1 million, and if you accept it, now there's another $1 million of debt in the world. But how do we actually know that we can discharge all that debt, that there's enough exchange media in the world to actually discharge all the debt that's been created, right? And this is the thing that provokes the anxiety among people that want to say that, fractional reserve is a Ponzi scheme, and maybe it is because everyone's so anxious, there's so much debt being created, how do we know it's all going to be discharged? And often we find out it can't, and it seizes up in these liquidity crises, right? So this is the problem we want to really tune to, and this is really what liquidity is, right? Liquidity is the ability to discharge your debts when they're due, right? You can be insolvent for a long time, but liquidity kills you quick, right? And so this really motivates the question for us, thinking about this problem of liquidity and making sure we can discharge debts. It motivates this larger goal. How can we build a system that can clear the most debt for the most people with the least money? And use this as a foundation for building payment systems and building up to the rest of a financial system from that. And we think we can do that with Cycles. So let's get into the design.
Yeah, we're not going to get into the design today. If you can believe it, that was on 0.9 speed from Ethan. I thought about slowing it down even further, but he talks very fast. But I thought this was really, really interesting that the name of this conference is called the Science of Blockchains Conference. It's at Stanford every year. And when we talk about alternative financial infrastructure, I just think this is a really generative place to be. This idea that maybe we've been focusing a lot on the assets side of the balance sheet. Turns out that the banking system is much more focused on the debt side and the liability side. And that is a lot of how it functions. And in fact, a lot of how early money systems functioned. And so we're really curious about this branch of research, and we think that it has something to say about where the crypto ecosystem can go next in search for more interesting paths forward, more interesting alternative financial infrastructure. I kind of want to like pass it back perhaps to Annaliese there and then see if we want to open it up. Just to see if you have any thoughts on that and on like where you are, I guess, feeling today now that the research is concluded.
Yeah, no, that was super interesting, the cycles thing. I guess I would be interested to learn more. It's not super clear to me yeah, I would need to learn more about the project, I think. I mean, I think the thing about the way debt has been used for a long time, and I mean, sort of as a precursor to money, was that you weren't using payments, right? You were just operating on credit. And now we have debt-based money. So I'm very intrigued and very curious to see what they're doing, but I'm not sure that I totally understand what they're up to either. So maybe I'll defer a comment on that for a bit. But no, to answer your second question, no, all good, I think. It's obviously I mean, it's a very interesting time in crypto right now. I think it's an extremely interesting time given what's going on in the US with the Trump administration kind of getting into crypto. And so I'm sort of on the sidelines watching quite closely and keenly, trying to kind of work out if all of my research is going to be turned on its head, in the next year or so.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, very much a stamp in time, and we feel like still very relevant, kind of like generative places to end. I'd say perhaps we could open it up a bit. Ramona, if you're willing, I think you gave us a place to start, and if anyone else wants to raise hand, we can. Again, with the overall goal being just any snippets or thoughts about monetary systems that you know or that you feel like you can contribute to the conversation, contribute to the chat. The idea is like trying to piece together this kind of behemoth system, and we all have our own perspectives, try to pull together our thoughts and our links. But Ramona, if you're willing, maybe you could help us.
So I placed two items in there. And generational wealth versus generative wealth is something that came naturally when Annaliese was speaking about generational wealth and how that's sort of being eroded right now. And I think that comes from a legit perspective of, oh, I worked hard so my family can live better, so my children can benefit, so that they can have opportunities I'm not having, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a legit impulse. And at the same time, because of that legit impulse and that mechanism of wealth accumulation, we invented taxes and redistribution of wealth and social welfare and support systems, right? So that in itself, it triggers the other side of the coin, I think, for that. It automatically taxes, redistribution, equalization of chances at one point, because otherwise, like the generational wealth will accumulate in a sort of like it will become unfair for everybody else, right? The later generations. So several generations out, that mechanism in itself, it's corroded itself. Versus generative wealth, where we see this in the United States, especially the startup mindset, pursuing the goal, like a lot of the billionaires we're seeing started from scratch. We're seeing like we do have this story, and this is a generative story that creates wealth, right? That tells people that they can pursue their dreams and that they can make it for themselves and they can generate their own wealth, and then it becomes generational. That particular is a driver for economic growth. It's a driver for startups and for entrepreneurships, and it's pushing people forward, right? So that's also one impulse that is needed. And I think that money behaves in different ways in these two different mechanisms, right? So this is something that I would like to pursue. I don't actually have the pieces yet, but it sort of resonated with me as you were speaking, Annaliese. So I would be curious to have your input on this, your experience with this also, and then from others.
Is it okay if I go ahead, Vivek? Great. Thanks so much for your question, Ramona. I think it's really interesting. I think there's an obvious tension with the generational wealth thing, which is that if crypto is about kind of creating economic infrastructures that are different from the mainstream system, how do you prevent? And I think a lot of what's happening in crypto too is about, you know, some of the critiques are around kind of like the centralization of capital in the mainstream economy, and about distributing that capital differently, which is to say that if you look at, you know, the way that, say, like the SEC is gatekeeping capital with the accredited investor standard, that prevents, say, 90+% of Americans from participating in the private capital markets. And so you have kind of capital flowing in one direction to a certain class of people and not elsewhere. Crypto is obviously, I think, trying to counter this in myriad ways. And so the problem with generational wealth and the problem with kind of, you know, we're talking about inheritance basically, right? Is that there's a lot of work for sure now in academia that suggests that inheritance is a big driver of inequality. And that it's, you know, a cause of capital accumulation and things like that, and that it's kind of at the core of sort of economic systems that are not particularly fair. And so there's that tension with kind of wanting to create a system that is potentially more fair, potentially better suited to distributing wealth more widely, or at least according to different principles than the mainstream system, and the potential result of that, which is that do you just end up with more accumulation, you know, amongst a kind of particular group of people still? Have you just reproduced the traditional system in a sense? And I think it's kind of an open question, right? I don't think we have a huge amount of visibility into, like, I don't know. I mean, there are certainly studies that say that the wealth in something like, you know, amongst the Bitcoin community is very stratified, for example. Do we know this about the Ethereum community? Do we know kind of where our meme coin billionaires are today? You know, I don't know. I'm not sure if we have a lot of metrics on that. It's hard to kind of say. But yeah, the difference between something like generational wealth and generative wealth, I think, which is the other thing you were talking about, maybe that's a different way to think about it. And in a sense, I think crypto has that aspect of generative wealth, if I understand correctly what you're saying, when you were talking about, you know, billionaires, say, starting from nothing and kind of becoming quite wealthy in the end, and that kind of sense that there's an opportunity to become wealthy. I think that crypto is about kind of giving people that also, in a sense, because it's trying to tap into different sources of wealth that are kind of about giving people mobility in a way that doesn't exist in the mainstream economy right now. And so maybe we're talking about accumulation on the one hand with generational wealth, and we're talking about mobility on the other hand with generative wealth, and maybe there's kind of some overlap between them. Maybe they're not as distinctive as we think they are. But I don't know, those are kind of very, very loose thoughts. Maybe that's getting toward some sort of answer.
No, thank you for that. I appreciate your perspective, because it's important to consider. It's like money is just a visible thing, right? That we all get attached to, we kind of interact with, but actually money is supposed to follow value, reward value, and be, in addition to being the medium of exchange. It's like the reason I can do generative wealth, right? It's that I'm providing something of value that people want. I'm building something that people want, and therefore, you know, they give me money in order to have that thing that they can do for them or build for them. So that's the generative wealth part. The other thing that's it's perhaps invisible underneath money is that the wider drivers of economic activity in the world, right? Is like, should we look beneath? Should we ask, like, okay, what's beneath this form of money? What is the economic pattern, the undercurrents that are moving people in this way, in this particular way, that's emerged in this thing? Because yes, money can create these economic patterns, but most often, now that the doorway is being opened with Bitcoin, you know, showcasing that money, we kind of made it all up, right? And we can make up different forms of it, right? Now it's sort of like, okay, so what's driving us underneath, like a lot of the crypto, for example, community has been criticized of seeking alpha, perpetuating speculation, being speculation. That's one aspect of like getting rich quick movement that exists in every other field, not just crypto, right? So that's one human driver in terms of like quick fix, problem solve, really find something, is like oil, like snake oil type thing, right? But there's also other drivers. Is like I'm seeing more like with Bitcoin for specifically. I'm here in Prospera for Infinita Pop-Up City right now, which is continuing. And then Prospera has a Bitcoin center. They have built in Bitcoin ATM. They're working with other people, other projects in the region. And a lot of the drive from Latin and South America, for example, is coming from, we need to build some circular economies outside of the existing systems because we don't want to be devalued by the actions of a corrupt government, right? So we need to have some trust, and people have built systems that actually create stable sats so that they can pay themselves and have a circular economy in Bitcoin without the volatility of Bitcoin. That's amazing creativity, right? It's called Blink, and they use it here. So in terms of like this human drive of creating new ways and in creating new economies and how they interact with each other, and then how that is reflected in the story of money.
Thank you. Thank you, Ramona, for sharing. I wonder, we might bring in some other voices. If anyone else has anything to share, lots of good stuff in the chat. Feel free, don't be shy.
I kind of love just ask an open question to you, Annaliese. Just something along the lines of like, what do you see possible now that didn't seem possible even 2 years ago? Or like, are you like, what's the zeitgeist that you are experiencing given your 6 years of research on this topic that we might tap into, or, you know, by being made more aware of, like leverage something new that, you know, couldn't have been possible recently?
Ooh, I think that's a really hard question. I will say that anthropologists are not much good at predicting the future, and so that I will not really try. Yeah, I don't know. I think look, I mean, I think crypto is so unpredictable. It's really difficult to say. I think one thing that's clear is obviously it's not going away, I think, and that it seems to be the case that it's getting harder and harder for, I think, the world to kind of pretend like it is just going to go away, with some kind of interesting consequences politically right now. I mean, I think what wasn't very conceivable a few years ago was that crypto people would be kind of politically organizing in a way that was conventional. I think, you know, crypto obviously comes partly out of this free software, open source software tradition, and there's this kind of, you know, thinking that you don't really do politics in a conventional way. You try to change the world through code. And I think that that's still true, and that people are still trying to change the world through code, but also we now see some kind of movement in a more conventional direction where we're seeing some lobbying, you know, happening. We're seeing some political organizing in ways that look kind of, you know, pretty conventional. And I think that's going to be a challenge for crypto going forward because it's an incredibly diverse community, I think, ideologically speaking and politically speaking. It's not going to be a smooth transition, I think, or maybe a comfortable one if parts of the community become kind of conventionally political in ways that other parts of the community dislike. And so I think that will be something that I'm watching, something that will be interesting to watch, especially in light of the fact that the government now seems to, I don't know, almost want to maybe appropriate kind of crypto in some way, whether that's for its, you know, jobs agenda or its kind of innovation agenda or for more nefarious uses, such as, you know, I don't know, internet power or kind of corruption with the Trump meme coin or what have you. And I saw another question in the chat. I think somebody asked, what would it mean for my research to be turned on its head? I think that's kind of what I was getting at, which is that you have crypto in the last, 15 odd years of its life kind of being aligned against the state in many ways. And look, and I think this is more complicated than the way I've just stated it. The US has had crypto on its balance sheet for many years now because of seizures. So therefore it's been a stakeholder in crypto in ways that have been under recognized. Not everybody in government is kind of aligned against crypto. It's kind of endlessly complicated, but never have we really seen the government turn around and sort of say, today we like you, today we're going to do something different. And we might create a strategic reserve, or we might just sort of be very vocally pro crypto. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that pans out. And yeah, certainly it's just a different kind of, it poses a different kind of question for crypto. It's easy to be anti-establishment in a way. It's less, it gets more complicated when the establishment starts saying, ooh, maybe we can be friends. It gets a little bit tricky.
I want to illustrate just how deep it goes, and maybe this also gets to Ramona's last point about like what is the current structure, and anyone else feel free to chime in. We could also just like hear what people think, but this by and large is the like conclusion, one of the conclusions of Perry Mehrling's study, which again it's just so worth going through. There's so much stuff around it. It's like right before this image is shown, it says Mehrling, he's really trying to connect the worlds of finance and banking for the participants in this course. And he's trying to talk about finance, not the way that finance people typically talk about it to each other, but in a way that makes sense to humans. So we'll be thinking about these like swaps in the way that a normal person could think about them, and it leads to this modern money pyramid that that is at the top references Federal Reserve notes, what used to be gold that kind of underpins the system. Then you have currency. Then you have deposits into banks, oftentimes by people like you and I, but by others in the system. And then you have credit that those banks are willing to issue. And it turns out like a big part of this pyramid is actually credit. And which is why Ethan's point is that you can't talk about payment systems without talking about credit. And I guess a few notes to underpin what Annaliese was just saying is just like stablecoins mean that the purchasers of Federal Reserve notes, which really underpins the whole modern money pyramid, there are some predictions that say that stablecoin issuers will be the top purchaser of US Treasuries in the next 5 to 10 years, which means that stablecoins are really like a big part of this picture that is the picture of how modern money works. And so it's like, it's not a small thing. It's not a like some random thing. People are really talking about it. And there's a lot of chatter right now within crypto circles about how stablecoins will be regulated, especially because the main issuer of stablecoins in the US, Circle and Coinbase, they have a very specific regulatory agenda that seems to be at odds with some other innovators in the crypto space. And they have a lot of relationships with the regulators. And so there is this tension happening in real time right now around how stablecoins will be regulated, where Circle and Coinbase might be in favor of some policies that strengthen their position within the stablecoin issuance market, namely going after Tether and USDT, and also potentially going after innovators who are trying to do different styles of stable coins that might not be so pegged to the US dollar. So there's this real thing happening. And then just in general, there's like with stablecoins, regardless of how that regulation part goes, it's just like, well, this chart might give us some answers towards the future. To Jared, your question, I think it really points to the potential opportunities, and to me is why Ethan's work on credit is so interesting. The suggestion here is that like the top most parts here are kind of about Bitcoin as an electronic cash system, and that next, you might think about like how banks have been the number one beneficiary of the fact that you can clear massive amounts of debt without money. They don't have to like have physical bills like the way an average citizen does to clear debts. And so that might be like an interesting next place to go. But open to other thoughts, other understandings of money or questions.
I have a question that kind of ties into the last few. And Annaliese, I don't want to ask you to try to predict the future. But I was going through the Graeber lecture on the first 5,000 years from Google from I think 2012, which is in the syllabus. And he had a quote. He was talking something about how most revolts in history have been because of debt, and how that's one of the big kind of fears of the elites is the kind of overthrow and then redistribution. And he kind of makes the observation that in the current system, the creditors are protected, not the debtors, and that kind of tends to be the kind of common requirement for successful systems. You can definitely, please correct me if I'm misquoting any of this, but then he had one specific quote that I wrote down, which is, if democracy means anything now, it means that everyone gets to weigh in on what promises are made and what promises are kept, and when circumstances change, what sort are renegotiated. And I feel like I grew up in the West and have at this point multiple generations of confidence in some sort of civic stability, and so it's really hard to imagine what that might look like in a sort of unprecedentedly disruptive or unstable time. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on this, maybe what you're seeing as kind of what you've seen cropping up in the past, what's going on now, and maybe some forecasts of what you might think we might see coming in the future.
Yeah, it's nice to see you, John. Hope you're doing well.
You too.
And yeah, no, I think you've certainly no, I think you paraphrased Graeber well, to my understanding at least. Yeah, and I think, I mean, what he's getting at with the fact that creditors are protected, I mean, we're talking about, David was very much of the view that states are really important for making markets. And part of the reason that debt relations are what they are today is because you have courts and contracts, and courts that enforce contracts and things like that, and people that make sure that debt gets paid. Whereas previously in history, this was all a bit loose, and you could renegotiate the terms of debt, kind of so long as both parties agreed, and this was not something that necessarily happened inside the walls of the courtroom. It could, just be between two peers in a community. Yeah, so I think, I mean, the quote is very interesting because the question is really to what extent things can be negotiated or renegotiated in our democracy, in the United States specifically. And my feeling in researching crypto was that a lot of people felt like, actually, there isn't a lot that's up for renegotiation. And that for that reason, that's why crypto exists, because there's this really great historian called Lawrence Goodwin, who wrote this fantastic book about the populist movement in the United States in the 19th century. But he was also a writer of, well, a historian of the civil rights movement and things like that. And he made this point that, you know, in the United States in the 20th century, when he was writing, there was a feeling that you just can't get much done in politics these days. You just kind of can't accomplish very much through the traditional channels of representative democracy. And I think, you know, probably 50, 60, 70 years after he was writing, I think that that kind of conviction is still true. And I think it's especially keenly felt in crypto. And I think it's especially the case that people are doing what they're doing because they don't feel like representative democracy kind of is sufficient for renegotiating the terms of not just debt, but yeah, the kind of terms on which we govern economic and democratic life in the US. Because it feels like some things are just kind of untouchable. Some things won't change. Some things are kind of not on the table for discussion, so to speak. And I think that's going to be, I mean, it's interesting in a sense to have somebody like Trump come in and do what he's doing, because he is, I think, in a way doing some of the things that were thought to be off the table, like trying to cut defense spending in a big way, or getting rid of something like USAID. You know, he's not touching like entitlements programs like Social Security and things like that, and that non-discretionary spending stuff is where I think a lot of that stuff is to some extent non-negotiable, because Congress doesn't really vote to keep funding it every year. And that's maybe because there's good social consensus that those things should exist, but it's also potentially because we haven't really examined those things and whether there's kind of a mandate for them to exist, which please don't misunderstand me as saying I'm against Social Security or anything like that. But just to say that I think there are a lot of distribution programs and a lot of kind of mechanisms of distribution in the United States particularly that go unexamined in daily life and that are kind of not up for debate or renegotiation in election cycles. Kind of nobody's willing to run on trying to get rid of Social Security. Not that they necessarily should, but that you'd never see that happen. There's just a lot that's kind of considered to be off the table. And I think the debt thing is particularly an interesting question because the national debt is growing, and there's kind of a real reluctance to engage with this, I think, in academia. There's a kind of feeling that you can just keep, like modern monetary theory, you can just sort of keep creating money and things like that, and it will all just be okay ultimately. I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not, you know. I don't know. I think there's a lot of geopolitical kind of complications with the way that the US uses its debt as a kind of monetary weapon in some ways. And if that system gets destabilized, I don't know what's going to happen to the national debt. But I think there are questions that are worth asking about all of that that probably nobody's asking. And also I think the debt question is interesting because if you use deficit spending to fund a lot of things, like Jimmy Song, for example, makes this point in a blog post, which is that if you're not really taxing people directly to pay for things, you they don't feel it so directly. You're kind of just sneaking it past them in a sense. If you're just drawing on debt to fund whatever you're doing, it's a little bit easier for it to all kind of fall to the wayside and to go unnoticed until it's a little bit too late. So there's a kind of feeling in short that deficit spending is bad for democracy in some ways. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but just a few thoughts.
Maybe a good moment for Sam, if you're willing. If you have any thoughts on what Annaliese just shared, any new points to share for the group on your own understanding of modern monetary theory.
Yeah, modern monetary theory, I mean, I think it's sort of become the consensus default neoliberal way to incentivize people to like stay on the hamster wheel, because if your money is constantly being debased and you can just print more to pay for all the things that we need that also like improve society, like the collective debt, like the national debt, this huge number, it doesn't really matter because the US dollar is the default medium of exchange because of because of it's how we settle oil payments basically today, as it's now the petrodollar. before it was, we had a different reason why it was the default medium of exchange, but we also, you know, through central bank policy and through things like the IMF forces smaller nation states into debt agreements with the United States in exchange for aid and things like this. So these are things that sort of like back up the value of the debt-based dollar in a totally globalized scale. And now we're seeing nation states sort of opt out. China is no longer buying bonds. Bonds are another thing that sort of like secures the debt value of the dollar. And yeah, like people have this notion that like credit is a bad thing and debt is like wrong or immoral. You know, it's like even it's in some religions, like lending is bad. But really it's sort of like, it's the way that we expand our, I don't know, if we didn't have access to credit, we couldn't get loans to start businesses. We couldn't, startups couldn't, you know, innovate these great things, pour money into R&D to create new technologies. And so like sort of the question I have is, yeah, if this money system of debt is secured by nation states, and originally when we entered the Bretton Woods Agreement, it was like under the pretense that the US military was going to guarantee trade routes for everyone who enters the agreement. So it's like sort of this money system that's secured by violence, state violence. And if we can we create a credit system that doesn't rely on nation states? How do you enforce the agreements? We rely on, yeah, A, the military industrial complex to enforce the agreements between nation states, and B, the court system, and then, you know, extrapolating from that, like police, you know, you go to jail eventually if you don't pay up, kind of thing. The court system that is like made real by nation states. How do you do this stuff without states? That's a question I have.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for that, Sam. That was super interesting. I wonder if maybe you've read the book Super Imperialism by Michael Hudson. And if you haven't, I would totally recommend it to everybody who's interested in the kind of geopolitical implications of the way that the US uses monetary policy, and the way that it has kind of weaponized monetary policy since World War II. I would really, really recommend it. It's, I think, very illuminating. Yeah, the question is, how do you do it differently without states? So I think, in a sense, that's what crypto is trying to find out. You know, the alternative, I think, that preceded all of this stuff is, I mean, if you go way back, is peer-to-peer lending, right? People just sort of, you know, taking on debt or giving each other loans in a kind of village context or sort of, you know, small society kind of context, where you have high levels of trust because you live in a pretty small area and you know everybody, and you have kind of yeah, basically high levels of trust. I mean, that's one story, right? Is that I'm just reading a book about this actually from a historian, and I think the implication is like, okay, what is the alternative? Is the only alternative to have peer-to-peer lending in a very small scale society? When you live in bigger, complex societies, what do you do? Is there any alternative to the state? And I think there is, and I think what crypto is trying to do is reconcile this fact that you have a kind of low trust environment, large scale, you know, it's a very kind of cosmopolitan outlook. Crypto is built for a kind of global, you know, interconnected system. It's a means of coordinating people across, you know, vast geographical distances and things like that. And so I think crypto is trying to work that out, and it's trying to build an infrastructure that can kind of mediate in a sense and be a kind of disinterested mediator. And that's, I think, the role of the code in a sense, is to try and be a disinterested mediator. I don't know really, in short. I don't know if crypto will kind of accomplish this. I'm not saying that crypto is going to replace, you know, the sort of world economic system that we have at present. Certainly not. I would make no such bets. But yeah, I think I mean, there's a real question, I think, of if the US is maybe in decline, if it's the case that its kind of grip on the global financial system is maybe slipping, if we end up with a multi-currency kind of world where the US isn't the reserve currency in the way that it had been since the Second World War, what happens? Is the system sustainable? How do people work it out? In truth, I have no idea. I'm sure there's historical precedent for this. I'm sure there's I mean, obviously the world wasn't always like the way it is now. This is a very modern system in the sense that it really is just the result of the post-war order. And so I think we'd probably need to look back before that, and we'd probably need to kind of consider the history and also consider that we also have no idea. We'll have to see what happens.
What was the second of those books, Annaliese, the one by the historian that you were reading?
The second book is called Money Before Banks.
Before Banks.
I'll just put it in.
Justin, please, we're kind of coming in towards close now, but I'd love to hear from you.
Annaliese, I think, thank you, Juan, and I feel like you spoke from a perspective that was that of a millennial. Actually, an American millennial, kind of recognizing our, what we've inherited from past, or from these other generations. And also, I think, I see us having a role for those that are behind us too. These Gen Zs and these alphas that are in the world. And I just wondered, how are you responding to this present moment in ways that maybe keep you energized to go forward in your work, or that give you purpose, or other things that you recommend for us as those that are committed to being able to make the most of what we have, and also maybe like support those that are coming behind us. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you for your question. No, I think honestly, I think spaces like Kernel are pretty great for that, to be honest. I think being with a group of people like this that's super reflective and that kind of wants to think through these problems, and doesn't just assume that we're all sort of doomed is a pretty good place to start, I find it very refreshing, especially when a lot of, I think crypto in a sense is very different from other groups of people. I don't know if, crypto people really consider themselves to be activists, but certainly if you look to other groups of activists, the kind of sentiment isn't always so optimistic, let's say. And certainly there are people who be very, very critical of crypto's optimism, and I've met lots of them in academia. But I find something, I find it endearing, I think, in a way, and I find it refreshing also. This kind of idea that, look, there are problems in the world, but actually we should try and fix them, and we should try and build something, not just sort of, let's not just talk about them, let's try and experiment. And try and come up with some ways that we can work on these problems. And that is not to say that the solutions that have arrived are perfect, or that they've worked as intended or anything like that. But it is to say that I respect the ingenuity, I respect the commitment to experimenting, I respect the commitment to trying.
Thanks for that. Annaliese, I think we've already taken 5 more minutes. Do you have any final feelings or thoughts that you'd like to share? How can people keep up with your work beyond the thesis and onwards?
Yeah, no, it's been fabulous being here with all of you. I can certainly put my email in the Slack. You can always reach me on Slack or Twitter. I'm going to hopefully be publishing a book here, not in the too far future, and as well as some other things, so I can keep you all posted. But also feedback. If you have any feedback on any of the things you've heard, or if you happen to look at my thesis and you think, wow, what's she talking about? She's really off her rocker. I would love to know. Feedback is very, very, very welcome. So this for me is a dialogue. It's not me sort of saying what is happening in crypto. It's me trying to understand, and part of that is really being in dialogue with you all.
We'd love to do any work on dialogue sessions. Junto's on the way to the book being published. Any minor teasers on, is it from the thesis? Has it taken new shape and form?
Yeah, it's from the thesis. I think it'll be slightly reshaped, but I've had a little bit of interest from a publisher already, which is good. So signs are looking good. It's all very much TBD at the minute, but we're moving in the right direction. So I'll keep you posted.
Good. Best of luck. Best of luck. Thank you so much for being here, Annaliese. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for sharing, as you always do. If anyone else has thoughts on this module, please feel free to share them in Slack. The DeFi channel got renamed DeFi and Money to try to meet us on this whole money research escapade. And any of your work that feels relevant and in general that you want to share, we look forward to seeing it in office hours and slowly developing. So take good care, everybody. See you soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.